Imagine a low hedge of dark berries and white, lace-like flowers ringing a village green, a living fence that fed the pantry, flavored the table, and, by common belief and practice, helped keep families standing in seasons of sickness. Protected villages through plagues. Why did we forget elderberry? The image has the clarity of an old photograph. In one frame, a woman lifts a steaming pot from a wood stove, and the kitchen fills with a tart floral scent. In another, a child slips a spoonful of syrup from a jar hidden in a larder. For centuries, across parts of Europe and in regions of North America where related species took hold, people planted and tended elder trees and shrubs not just as ornament, but as practical infrastructure. Hedgerows that offered food, medicine, shelter for birds, and seasonal ritual. Those living fences were ordinary, unpatented, and woven into daily life. Then, in the sweep of modernity, much of that knowledge frayed. The question is neither romantic nor purely botanical. What happens to a community when the small, resilient things it once relied on are pushed to the margins? Records of elders' many uses sit scattered across herbals, cookbooks, and oral histories. Flower heads were steeped for light cordials and fritters. Ripe, cooked berries were preserved as jams, wines, and concentrated syrups. Wood was used for tool handles and pipes. The plants featured in seasonal rites and household calendars. In many places, elder was what might be called a multi-tool of rural life. At once food, flavoring, source of income, and a go-to when the pantry otherwise ran thin. An old county herbal, surviving in fragments, describes recipes for syrups and cordials alongside notes about seasonal harvesting and cautions to cook the fruit before eating. Small, practical knowledge passed down in kitchen notebooks and backroom conversations. Those scraps of memory are the closest thing history gives us to a ledger of everyday resilience. Communities in times of crisis have always turned to the resources at hand. In wartime kitchens and under blockade, foraging and home preservation were not quaint hobbies, but necessity. Grandmother's jars kept families through shortages. Mothers learned to stretch sugar and flavor thin pottages with what grew by the hedgerow. Oral histories from rural districts recount the late summer bounty of dark elderberries transformed into concentrated preserves, an ingredient measured out in teaspoons to flavor broths and in larger doses to sweeten thin porridge. These vignettes are not claims that a plant conquered disease, but they are testimony to a lived relationship, people using what grew nearby to bolster strength, soothe coughs, and make calories more palatable. Elderberry's role in folk practice extended into the realm of protective ritual as well. Wards, charms, and seasonal customs often included sprigs of elder or the placing of elder branches at thresholds, acts less of magical thinking than of cultural memory that a plant belonged to the household's health and continuity. Such practices anchored community knowledge. They encoded which plants to harvest, when to preserve, and how to share what remained. To lose those practices was to lose more than recipes. It was to lose practical knowledge for surviving scarcity. But the arc from ubiquitous hedgerow to marginal shrub is shaped by larger forces. Industrialization remade land and labor. Fields consolidated. Hedgerows were removed to create larger parcels for mechanized agriculture, and familiar patterns of foraging and small-scale preservation receded as wage labor and grocery distribution networks expanded. At the same time, medicine professionalized and centralized. Practices that had been household-level remedies were increasingly set aside for clinic-based care and standardized pharmaceuticals. Where once a family might reach for a homemade cordial, later generations were taught to trust a labeled bottle from a counter. The unseen logic that accompanied this shift favored what could be standardized, packaged, and sold under exclusive property regimes. A living hedge, cultivated and shared from cutting to cutting across generations, does not easily fit into a model that rewards patentable, scalable products. There is also a stigma that shadows many once common plants. Species associated with poverty or with older, peasant ways were often judged unfashionable or backward. As aspiration moved toward modern homes, shopping, and hospital-based care, elements of domestic botanical knowledge were quietly consigned to the realm of the obsolete. That social forgetfulness is partly a consequence of progress, of desire for reliability and convenience, but also of a politics of value that prices what can be capitalized and discards what cannot. Science, when it catches up to folk practice, can be slow and cautious. Elderberries contain pigments and chemicals, chief among them groups like anthocyanins and various flavonoids that give the fruit its deep color and which, in laboratory contexts, can show biological activity. Some preliminary studies in vitro and a few small clinical trials have explored elderberry preparations and reported hints that certain extracts may influence the course of common respiratory symptoms or viral activity. Those investigations are early, often limited by small sample sizes or constrained study designs, and cannot be read as proof of prevention or cure. Scientists who talk about these results tend to emphasize uncertainty, promising signals that nonetheless require larger, rigorous trials before any firm conclusions. Framing elderberry as a centuries-old folk remedy with interesting biochemical properties is different from calling it a medical panacea. There are practical safety notes woven into the folk wisdom. Raw elderberries and some other parts of the plant contain compounds that can cause gastrointestinal discomfort if eaten uncooked. Traditional methods nearly always included cooking or fermenting the fruit before consumption. That knowledge, how to render a plant both palatable and safe, was as crucial as recipes for cordials or preserves. In revivals today, herbalists and small producers emphasize these cautions, underscoring that traditional use is instructive but must be paired with clear instructions and respect for modern safety standards. If the hedge fell because of mechanized fields and professional medicine, it is being replanted in pockets. There's a quiet revival across community gardens, permaculture projects, and chefs' pantries. Chefs who once disdained the poor flavors of wild hedgerow fruit now value the depth and locality of elderflower and elderberry syrups for cocktails, reductions, and desserts. Small-scale growers see an opportunity not for monoculture profits, but for multi-service plantings. Hedgerows that offer nectar for pollinators in spring, berries for preservation in late summer, and branches that stabilize soil and shelter wildlife through winter. Herbalists and community educators have reshaped the narrative from mystical panaceas to stewardship and knowledge recovery. Workshops on responsible harvesting, species identification, and safe preparation have sprung up in urban and rural settings alike. One community garden program in a mid-sized town, anecdote, the program began as a food safety response to supply disruptions and now includes a small elderberry nursery, is teaching school children to take cuttings, graft, and label varieties so that practical knowledge travels from one generation to the next. These are modest projects with outsized cultural effects. They reconnect hands, taste, and seasonal time. Farmers practicing agroecology advocate elder hedgerows as living infrastructure. Planted along field margins, rows of Sambucus, the genus containing common elder species, can reduce erosion, provide habitat, and serve as part of integrated pest management strategies by attracting beneficial insects and offering refuge to predatory birds. Such hedgerows are not substitutes for medical systems, nor do they prevent disease by themselves. They are, however, part of a diversified landscape that makes food systems and communities more resilient to shocks, storms, supply bottlenecks, and the social stresses that accompany emergency situations. Revivalists also navigate hard trade-offs. In some regions, related elder species can become aggressive in disturbed habitats. In others, they are valued but require particular attention to local ecology. Responsible reintroduction requires knowing which species are appropriate to a locality. Sambucus nigra is widespread in parts of Europe. Sambucus canadensis and other species fill similar niches in North America, and understanding impacts on native plant communities. Practitioners advise sourcing from local nurseries, participating in seed and cutting exchanges with regional groups, and following stewardship practices that discourage monoculture or invasive spread. The story of elderberry's marginalization is also a cautionary tale about what gets lost when knowledge is privatized. Medicinal chemistry, vaccine development, and pharmaceuticals have delivered undeniable public goods. Yet the economic logic that drives innovation tends to prioritize things that can be patented, mass-produced, and marketed at scale. That system has created great advances, but it has also sidelined forms of living knowledge that are essential precisely because they are diffuse, local, and non-proprietary. A hedge you plant with neighborhood cuttings resists commodification, and for that reason alone, it can be invisible to systems that count value by market metrics. This is not an argument to romanticize all things pre-industrial. Household remedies were sometimes dangerous or ineffective. Not every traditional practice withstands scientific scrutiny. The point is to recover a balanced view, to recognize that community-level practices once provided meaningful buffers, and that forgetting them leaves a kind of structural vulnerability. Reintroducing elder hedgerows and the knowledge that goes with them isn't a substitute for public health infrastructure. It is a complementary strategy that builds redundancy into a fragile system. What would that reintroduction look like in practice? Start with the soil around homes and schools. Hedgerows planted with diverse shrubs, including appropriate species of elder, offer multi-purpose benefits: seasonal pollinator resources, fruit for preservation, and physical windbreaks that reduce heating costs in colder climates. Community nurseries can propagate local varieties from cuttings, share planting plans, and teach safe preparation techniques for flowers and berries. Farmers can integrate hedgerows into field margins as part of agroecological design, balancing cropland with living edges that increase biodiversity. In urban settings, container plantings and public garden plots can teach children how to tend a plant through seasons, harvesting responsibly and preserving small batches of syrup or cordial for community meals. Practical stewardship matters. Teach people to cook berries before consumption, to avoid relying on wild harvesting alone without species identification, and to check local guidelines about planting non-native varieties. Promote seed and cutting exchanges that prioritize locally adapted material. Document recipes and custodial knowledge in community archives, photographs of jars, short interviews with elders, and handwritten notes from home kitchens that can be passed down without being commodified. There are legal and ethical dimensions too. As interest in elderberry grows, markets will inevitably follow. Small producers selling syrups, tinctures, and preserves must navigate food safety regulations and honest labeling. Community-minded efforts should resist the urge to privatize heritage plants or extract local knowledge for profit without fair benefit to the communities that nurtured it. A respectful approach recognizes the cultural and ecological labor behind any living practice. The present moment, marked by climate uncertainty, strained supply chains, and recent experiences of pandemic, creates a sharp sense of urgency. Not as fear-mongering, but as a sober assessment. Diverse, locally rooted resources can soften the blow of disruptions. Elderberry hedgerows will not stop epidemics, cure infection, or replace hospitals. They can, however, restore a measure of practical autonomy. Jars in pantries, flowers for small comforts, bushes that pull the landscape toward biodiversity rather than away from it. Consider a final small scene. On a late summer afternoon, a group of neighbors gathers by a new hedgerow. Someone brings a kettle, someone else brings jars and spoons. Children learn to strip elderflower heads gently so the blossoms remain intact, while an elder in the group recounts how a similar hedge kept birds nesting and provided fruit through hard winters. The group cooks down the berries, tests for flavor, and writes the recipe on a card to pin to the garden shed. The act is modest and repetitive, but it is also a cultural repair. preserving taste, passing on safety secrets, and learning how a plant can be woven back into the fabric of communal life. So, if the question is why we forgot elderberry, the answer is not a single cause, but a tangle of social change. Mechanized landscapes, the centralization of medicine, shifts in taste and status, and an economic system that prizes what is sellable over what is sustainable. Yet, memory and abundance are not irretrievable. Through intentional planting, responsible stewardship, community exchange, and cautious engagement with science, elder hedgerows can be part of a pragmatic plan for resilience. They offer a small but vital kind of insurance: local biodiversity, edible and medicinal knowledge practiced with humility, and social practices that strengthen ties when external systems strain. If this exploration speaks to you, and you care about reclaiming forgotten resilience, subscribe and share. There are more vaults of living knowledge to uncover. Planting a hedge, swapping cuttings, and learning to preserve are acts of care rather than promises. For those ready to begin, start locally. Check which Sambuca species is native or appropriate to your region. Seek cuttings from community nurseries and learn proper preparation methods so fruit is cooked before consumption. Join or start a seed and cutting exchange. Document recipes and oral histories in a community archive, and consider hedgerows as part of a broader plan for landscape stewardship. The resources and responsible planting guides are linked in the description for those who want practical steps and further reading. Protected villages through plagues, perhaps not in the literal, miraculous sense, but in the grounded, everyday way that households and neighborhoods support one another. Elderberry, once woven into that fabric, can be woven back in, not as a cure, but as a living, shared tool for resilience.